Basically, you've got room number if you need to fill that out, resident name. If there's more than one PTA, just write your initials there so the PT knows who's doing the information for them. Does the resident complain of pain? Write where they complain of pain, and the explanations are at the bottom that ask you just to indicate what you're writing. For modalities, you would write which modalities are being used with the resident. If you look at the bottom, if they've got TENS, you can just write T. If they've got ultrasound, you can write US, whatever, okay? And it's even easier if you write T for TENS and then back, or T right shoulder, or something like that. If they're participating in group classes, if you look down here, it says to write either sit or stand, just to remind us if they're doing sitting or standing classes. Then there's weights for arms and legs. If you look down here for weights, if the resident uses weights for strengthening, please specify how heavy it is. So if they're using 1 pound or 2 pound weights for their arms, or maybe 5 pound cuff weights around their ankles for their legs, you can just indicate it there. Maybe they're using TheraBand for strengthening exercises for their arms or legs. You can, if you look here, it says just to indicate the color of the TheraBand that they're using. Range of motion for arms and legs. It says please write A for active range, AA for active assisted, or P for passive. You can also write right and left. So if somebody's had a stroke, maybe they have P, range of motion, on their right arm, and A, range of motion, on their left arm, for example. So you can specify that under the range of motion part. Sit to stand, number of assist. Here what I would like to see is how many people does this resident need help from to be able to stand up. So if one person is good enough to help them stand and they are practicing sit to stand as part of their treatment program, you can just write a 1. You can write 1, 10 reps, or maybe times 2, A times 2, assist times 2, 10 reps, or something like that. What about walking? How far approximately are they walking, and how many people do they need to help them? So it might be 150 feet, A times 2, to assist. Refusals. What are there treatments that they refuse specifically? Do they refuse everything regularly? Do they rarely refuse? Just to give us an idea, so when we go see the resident, if we don't have a chance to touch base with you verbally, it's basically just to know, do I need to talk to this resident about the certain parts of their treatment plan that they're refusing, to find out why they're refusing and maybe suggest something else instead. And then notes. So if notes here, I had please put an asterisk there if there's something else that you'd like to discuss, or somewhere else that you need to write details. If it does happen a lot that you need more room to write more details, you could leave the back of the form blank and you could just write it on the back. However, I think there's enough information at the front part here that you don't need to add any other specific notes. So that's the PTA Quarterly Resident Summary. And now we're going to look at the Resident Monthly Blurb Tracking Sheet, and this is what it looks like. And we use this in nursing homes, retirement homes, and community homes. So for retirement and community home team members, you'll notice this looks surprisingly like the resident reevaluation tracking sheet, because it is the same thing, but this is for the PTAs to use. What I found is some residents participate in group exercises. They're very advanced. Or some residents are very dependent and they only have passive range, yet their care is being maintained and they're not declining, they're not improving, they're staying the same. And so what I find is that sometimes for some residents we have no written notes on them whatsoever for months and months and months on end. And the only thing we have is that they're continuing in their program log. The monthly blurb was because many homes were starting to ask for monthly updates on how residents were doing, and after discussion with some of the other physios, it was decided that it would be a really good idea to have just a quick little blurb, hence the monthly blurb tracking sheet, to have a quick little blurb on each resident every month, just so that there's something on them every month. So for example, what would be a blurb? Mrs. Smith continues her walking program and is doing well. Mr. Jones continues balance exercises and is doing well. Mr. Smith continues to refuse treatment. We will continue to encourage him to participate when able. Mrs. Jones is not walking as well as she has been. PT has been asked to reevaluate. Just a quick blurb, a one-sentence deal on how the resident is doing. If you've already had to write a note on the resident for some reason that month because of an unusual occurrence, or you've noticed that their program needed change because it's too easy or too hard, and you've already documented on the resident that month, you don't need to do a monthly blurb. When you do your monthly blurb, so here I would suggest writing the residents' names down on one side, put the year at the top of the sheet, 2011, 2012, whatever it may be. And when you write their blurb in January, just check it off. When you write it in February, just check it off. It's just to help keep track of who you've written your blurbs on. Most PTAs have 60 to 80 residents on their caseload if they're full-time, okay? A full-time PTA with 60 to 80 residents on their caseload, and you figure there's about 20 to 22 working days per month. If you write 3 or 4 blurbs per day, you'll be done at the end of the month, and the next month you can start over. I highly recommend not waiting until the end of the month to write all of your blurbs, because you're going to have one day full of a ton of admin time, and you don't need that. It's hard on the residents, it's hard on your schedule. Instead, incorporate that 4 or 5 minutes into every day to write a quick little blurb on 3 or 4 or 5 residents, and it'll become habit. And you'll have 4 or 5 check marks, and then 4 or 5 check marks, and then 4 or 5 check marks, and by the time you're done all your residents, you'll be able to start again up at the top in February. Okay? I highly, highly recommend doing 4 or 5 blurbs every day. Makes it much easier to manage and not as stressful at the end of the month. Okay, let's take a look at the preventative maintenance equipment records. You should have 3 of them in your binder. The first one is the daily one. You'll see it says up here 1.5 daily. And you'll also have, I've got them obviously backwards in the order, you'll also have a monthly one, which is 1.4 monthly preventative maintenance equipment record. And 1.3, the annual preventative maintenance equipment record. Basically, these 3 forms, daily, monthly, and annual, were created following my college audit because it was found that I needed a better way to document the fact that all of the equipment that we're using for the residents are being verified as every time they're being used. So for example, on the daily preventative one, you may have, the college said, you know, things like if you're using a walker for the walking program, even though it's not the physio department's walker, it may belong to the home or the restorative care department or the resident themselves. It has to be checked to make sure that all the screws are tight and the things aren't loose and whatever. So you may want to write up here, walking program walkers. Every time you do a walking program, you just have to check off that you did it and then sign your initials underneath. What are some of the other things we use daily? Maybe some of the X and Flex machines or pedalers or bikes, treadmills. You need to check these equipment pieces to make sure that they're safe so that the little pieces are tight. It seems a little ridiculous. However, sometimes we look at something and we can see that there's something wrong. We can document that here and say changed or whatever. You can make comments underneath. You can do a little star and say, you know, stopped using, whatever. If it's okay, just put a check mark. If it's not, put a star and then write the note somewhere else. So some of the things that were mentioned, for example, if you use pulleys with residents, then you're supposed to check the pulley cables to make sure they're not fraying. If you're using TheraBand with the Resonance or TheraTube, you need to check it to make sure it's not cracked or fraying and that it's going to break when they use it against resistance. If you're using bikes and treadmills, it's just to make sure that they look sturdy and that nothing is loose, the seats are good and tight on the bikes, the X and Flex, that the pedal straps are tight, just things like that. I guess as you're putting the Resonance feet into the pedal straps of the X and Flex or the Pedaler, give them a tug and make sure that they're safe. Wax bath. So if you may do wax bath for your Resonance once a week, for example. Walmart, department stores, they sell great little candy thermometers for $3 or $4. I suggest just picking up one of those thermometers and keeping it in the home, and just, if your wax bath does not already have a temperature indicator in it, you can just hold that thermometer in the middle of the wax for a couple of minutes until the temperature stops rising, just to ensure. Here you can write wax temp, safe range between whatever it is suggested for that wax bath. Some of them are low temperature paraffin baths and some of them aren't. So just check in the manual to see what the operating safe range is for that wax bath, and write it on your form so that when you're checking it off on the days that you use the wax bath, you're indicating that you've checked that the wax bath is in the safe temperature operating range. Hydrocollator, making sure that again, the water isn't too hot or the water is clean, whatever. That the hot packs aren't burst open. When you look at the monthly form, depending on the wax bath and the hydrocollator, you need to check in the instruction manual, because all of them are a little bit different, as to what the suggested cleaning schedule is. So for example, if you need to clean out the wax bath on a monthly basis, unplug it, let the wax go hard, replug it in so that the wax starts to melt on the outside, unplug it again, take out that big hunk of wax, clean out the wax bath, put the wax back in, or change the wax if the wax is dirty. Hydrocollator, you would need to unplug it, let the water cool down, empty it, clean it out, refill it, plug it back in. Okay, just an example of some things to check monthly. And you would write it on the same thing, so you could document that you checked it in January, checked it in February, checked it in March. You can either check it, or you can indicate the date that it was actually checked in that month. So if you checked it on January 15th, you would just write 15 in January. Okay. Another actually example that they suggested was for a TENS machine, just to make sure that the electrode wires don't look like they're loose or that there's actual wires showing. For the chest percussor, the mechanical percussor, the same thing. It has an electrical cord, so making sure that the cord looks safe. I keep rolling my eyes, don't I? Annual preventive maintenance equipment. So the college auditor that came to visit with me did mention that even though the home owns the equipment, I may be the one using it. For example, the wax bath or the hydrocollator, the treadmill. I went to my home's administrator to find out who was coming into their home on a regular basis to check their machines. So they've got blood pressure, temperature, pulse O2 oximeters. They've got bathtubs with heating and temperature controls and things, and they have to get them checked as well. So I asked who the company was that was coming in, and in our home it was Aramark, and they actually can do the verification of ultrasound, hydrocollators, wax bath, TENS machines, treadmills, bikes, things like that, the mechanical or electronic type equipment. And so I just asked our administrator to make sure that when the biomechanical engineer comes in from that company, Aramark, that he also have those physio equipment on his list to check. Some of those equipment are actually donated by us, and some of them belong to Physiomed Peaks. However, she had no problem adding them to her list because he was coming anyways, and it shouldn't take him that much longer. So when I know that the biomedical engineer comes in to check, I just need to document on here. To our home, he comes in January and July. So I'll be able to list those pieces of equipment on here that that biomedical person will be checking, and I'll just indicate the date that they were checked. So the next time that the college comes to do my audit, I'll have all of these documents clearly in place for them to look at, so that there's no question that I am having all of the machinery and electronics checked on a regular basis.